At 2 in the morning, the most powerful crime boss on the East Coast sat in a lawyer's office and signed away 15 years of empire building. Every territory, every deal, every shadow operation. In exchange for the right to be a father to a little girl he had only just met. The reason? She had handed him a crayon drawing and said, "For you, because you look sad." And in that moment, every million-dollar deal he had ever closed meant absolutely nothing. This channel exists for stories exactly like this one, where mafia power meets human vulnerability, where love outlasts every empire, and where family turns out to be the only thing worth building. The truth this story holds: no amount of power, money, or reputation can fill the space that belonging to someone leaves empty. If this story reached you, like, comment, share with someone who needs it most, and subscribe. We are here every day with stories that remind you what life is really for.
Catherine Kensington did not raise her voice. She did not have to. Her voice became low, slow, and perfectly clear. Each word landed like a cold, heavy stone. "What did you just say?" Her eyes narrowed, as sharp as a doctor's blade, scanning Lena from her worn-out shoes all the way up to her pale face. There was no shock in her eyes, only the icy calm of a woman who had spent 40 years by the side of the most powerful crime boss on the entire East Coast. This was a woman who was used to dealing with every kind of threat. "I will ask you one more time," Catherine said, taking a single step toward Lena. The scent of her expensive perfume drifted through the air, but there was nothing gentle about her stare. "What did you say about my son?" Lena swallowed hard, her throat feeling as dry as desert sand. She knew she had just kicked open a door she could never close again. The words she had spoken hung between them, too heavy to ever take back. "Ma'am, I know this sounds very—" Lena started, her voice trembling. She tried to force it to be steady. "Sounds very what? Unbelievable? Desperate?" Catherine interrupted. And now, her voice held something far more dangerous than just anger. It was filled with a cold, controlled disgust. "You have been in this house for less than 1 hour, and you have the nerve to stand here and tell me my son, Jude Kensington, is the father of your child." She took another step forward. Lena willed herself to step back, but her legs were frozen in place. "People who try to scam my family rarely have happy endings," Catherine said, her voice as smooth as silk. But her words carried the weight of a final judgment. "I have seen every type of person come to this house with every kind of sad story, all hoping to get a little money from the Kensington family. If that is what you are doing, I suggest you walk away right now while I am still using my words." Lena felt the chilling threat coiled inside that statement. This was not a warning from a rich woman angry with a disrespectful maid. This was a command from someone who was used to being obeyed and used to making sure that anyone who defied her simply vanished. But Lena had lived 27 years without anyone to catch her when she fell. She had slept in the back of a junk car at 16. She had given birth all alone in a county hospital with nobody to hold her hand. She was no stranger to fear, and she knew the real danger was not the woman standing before her. It was the truth burning inside her, fighting to be heard. "I am not trying to blackmail you," Lena said. Her voice shook, but she kept her eyes locked on Catherine's. "I did not know who you were before this morning. I had no idea who this house belonged to. All I know is that the man in that painting is the man I fell in love with 5 years ago. He told me his name was Jack. He came into the cafe where I worked every morning and ordered a black coffee, no sugar. He would laugh at his own terrible jokes. He would run his hand through his hair when he got embarrassed, and he kissed my forehead every single morning before he left." Lena's voice cracked on the last few words, but she fought back the tears, refusing to break down in front of this woman. Then one day, he was just gone. No note, no call. The phone number he gave me was disconnected, like he was a ghost. She took a deep breath. 6 weeks after that, I found out I was pregnant. I searched for him everywhere, but all I had was a fake name and the memory of a man I now realize I never really knew at all. Catherine did not move a muscle. Her expression was like a stone mask. But Lena saw something flicker deep in her eyes. It was not belief, not yet. Not, it was attention. The focused attention of someone who was finally listening instead of just waiting for their turn to talk. My daughter's name is Phoebe, Lena continued, her voice growing stronger, as if saying her child's name gave her strength. She is 4 years and 3 months old. I have raised her by myself from the very beginning. I had no help, no family, no one but me and my little girl. I did not come to this house looking for my daughter's father. I came here because the job pays 3 times what I made at the cafe, and my daughter deserves to have enough food on the table every single night. Lena stopped, catching her breath. Seeing his face in that painting was a complete accident, an accident I wish had never happened. The room became quiet. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long stripes of light across the expensive rug and the oak floor. The only sound was the steady ticking of the grandfather clock, marking time in the heavy air between them. Catherine studied Lena for a long moment. It was no longer a look of judgment, but the look of someone putting together the pieces of a puzzle, comparing what she had just heard to what she already knew, trying to find a lie and coming up empty. Then she turned, walked over to a deep blue velvet couch and sat down. Her back was still perfectly straight, but her shoulders relaxed just a tiny bit. It was a small change, but it was enough for Lena to see that a crack had just appeared in her armor. "Sit down," Catherine said. Her voice was still cold, but the sharp edge was gone. It had changed into something else, something like the voice of a seasoned detective when they suspect the person across from them might actually be telling the truth. "Start from the very beginning. Tell me everything. Do not leave a single detail out." Lena told her everything. She described Rosie's cafe in the South End, on the corner near the train station. She described the smell of roasting coffee beans in the morning, mixing with the steam rising from the wet streets. Jack, who she now knew was Jude, would always show up at exactly 7:30 in the morning, never a minute early or a minute late, like he had a clock built inside him. He always sat at the same small table by the window. He always ordered a black coffee with no sugar, and he always looked at her with those gray-blue eyes when she brought it to him, a look that had made her hands shake so much she almost spilled the coffee all over him that first week. Catherine listened without saying a word. She sat as still as a statue on the blue velvet couch. Only her eyes moved, watching every flicker of emotion on Lena's face, searching for any sign that she was lying. When Lena was finished, the room was quiet once again. Catherine stood up, walked over to a dark oak cabinet by the window, opened the second drawer, and pulled out a brown, leather-bound photo album. It was not the kind of album you leave out for guests to see, but something, a personal album with worn leather corners and a slightly loose spine. She set it on the coffee table in front of Lena without saying a word. Lena glanced from the album to Catherine, hesitant. "Open it," Catherine commanded, her voice sharp. Lena opened it to the first page, and the air instantly left her lungs. This was not the stern man from the oil portrait on the wall. This was Jude as he really was. This was Jude in his everyday life. This was the Jude she had known as Jack. One photograph showed him on a beach in Cape Cod, wearing a simple white t-shirt and shorts. He was smiling, his eyes squinted against the bright sun. The next photo was of him in a bar, a glass of beer in his hand, his head tilted back slightly as he laughed at something someone off camera had said. Then there was a birthday picture. He stood in front of a cake, the candlelight reflecting in his gray-blue eyes. That familiar smile was tilted just a little to the left, looking a bit shy, as if he was not used to being the center of attention. Lena paused, her finger gently touching the protective film over the beach photo. That smile. It always tilts to the left, and he squints in the sun instead of wearing sunglasses. She turned the page, stopping at the picture in the bar. He always holds his glass with his left hand, even though he is right-handed. And when he really laughs, he throws his head back and then runs a hand through his hair, almost like he is embarrassed. Lena's voice started to shake. My daughter does that exact same thing. Phoebe runs her hand through her hair when she gets nervous. She tilts her head when she laughs, and she is only 4 years old. She has mannerisms she has never seen, because the only other person who moves like her vanished before she was even born. Catherine remained silent as Lena slowly turned the pages. But Lena noticed that the woman's hand, which had been resting calmly in her lap, was now gripping the edge of her blazer so tightly, her knuckles had turned white. It was the only detail that gave away Catherine Kensington's real feelings. Then she stood, took her phone from her pocket, and dialed a number from memory. Brennan, she said, and the ice returned to her voice. I need a background check on someone. Lena Ashford, 27 years old. I want every detail from 6 years ago until today. Where she has lived, her jobs, medical records, everything. I want the results before tonight. She ended the call and turned back to Lena, her expression unreadable, as if the last 15 minutes had been nothing, more than a simple business call. You will go back to work now, Catherine stated. Mrs. Patton is waiting for you in the East Corridor. You will finish your shift as scheduled. No one, and I mean no one, is to know about this conversation. Not Mrs. Patton, not a single member of the staff, not anyone outside of this room. Lena got to her feet, her legs feeling weak. She could only nod. Catherine stepped forward, so close that Lena could see the tiny veins on her hand, strained from her tight grip. And Lena, she said, using her name for the first time, not girl or the new hire, but Lena. The way she said it carried a strange weight Lena could not quite understand. If those results show that you are lying, about even the smallest thing, you will wish you had never walked through those iron gates. The rest of the day felt like a hazy dream. Lena followed Mrs. Patton down the long east corridor, listening as the housekeeper went over the cleaning routine for every room. She explained which polish to use for the oak floors, which for the marble, and how to fold the bath towels into a perfect fan shape to meet Kensington standards. Lena nodded, memorized everything, and repeated it back when asked. But her thoughts were miles away, bouncing between the oil portrait, Catherine's frozen face, and the gray-blue eyes she saw every single day in her own daughter's face. Are you all right? Mrs. Patton asked, after Lena had dropped a dust cloth for the third time in 10 minutes. You seem a bit distracted. I'm sorry, Lena said, quickly picking it up and forcing a smile. It's just my first day. I'm a little nervous. Mrs. Patton gave an understanding nod and did not ask any more questions. She was a woman who knew when to let things be, and Lena was thankful for it. In the early afternoon, Mrs. Patton took Lena to the second floor, to the master suite. This is Mr. Jude's room, she explained, pushing open a heavy oak door. He is in London, but Mrs. Kensington insists it is kept spotless, as if he might come home at any moment. Lena walked inside and felt the atmosphere change completely. The room was huge, but felt surprisingly simple compared to the grandeur of the rest of the house. There was a king-sized bed with a dark wood frame, 2 nightstands with nothing but lamps on them, and a mahogany desk by the window that looked out onto the garden. On the desk sat a closed laptop and a picture frame that was turned face down. This was the room of a man who either did not want to leave a mark, or of someone who was trying to erase one. Mrs. Patton told her to change the bed sheets and dust all the surfaces. She then left to check on another part of the house, telling Lena to finish up and lock the door behind her. Alone in the room, Lena moved carefully, as if she were walking through a minefield. Her hands shook as she pulled the old sheets off the bed. When the scent from the pillow hit her, she had to pause, clutching the fabric with her eyes shut. Wood and bergamot. It was Jack's scent. It was the smell she had fallen asleep to every night in their tiny Dorchester apartment. It was the smell she had desperately tried to find on her own pillow for months after he disappeared, until it finally faded away, and she had to accept that he was really gone. And now, here it was, perfectly preserved, as if 5 years had never passed. Lena made herself keep going, change the sheets, dust the furniture, tidy up. When she got to the desk, she carefully wiped around the laptop and the picture frame. On her second pass, pretending to clean behind it, she picked the frame up. The photo was of Jude at a graduation ceremony with his parents. Someone was handing him a diploma. Catherine stood to his right, offering a rare smile, and a tall man with a stern face stood to his left, who Lena figured was Raymond Kensington. But it was not the picture that made her heart stop. It was what was tucked behind the frame. It was a small, round piece of cardboard with frayed edges, a pale brown color. She knew what it was instantly, even before she turned it over, because she had handled thousands just like it during her 5 years as a waitress. It was a cardboard coaster, the kind they used at Rosie's Cafe under every coffee cup. The Rosie's logo was almost gone, but you could still see the shape of the rose and the tiny letters underneath it. With trembling fingers, Lena turned the coaster over, nearly dropping it. On the back, in slanted blue ink, was her own handwriting. Lena. She remembered the moment perfectly, as if it had just happened. It was the first day Jack had ever come into the cafe. He had asked her for her name, but the place was so busy, she had just scribbled it on the coaster and rushed off to other tables. He had kept it. From that very first day, for 5 years, he had carried it from Boston all the way to London and hidden it behind a picture on his desk, in a room he demanded be kept perfect, as if he could return at any second. Lena put the frame back exactly where it had been. The coaster felt weightless in her palm, and yet it was the heaviest thing she had ever held. She stood there in Jude Kensington's room, surrounded by the scent of wood and bergamot, holding a coaster with her name on it. And for the first time, in 5 years, she let a thought she had buried deep inside come to the surface. Maybe he did not want to leave. Maybe he did not have a choice. As the sun set, painting the tall mansion windows a deep red, Lena was called to Catherine's study. This room was different from the main living room. It was smaller and more private, dominated by a large wooden desk and bookshelves that reached the ceiling. Catherine sat behind the desk. In front of her was a thin brown file, the type Lena knew did not come from any public records office. She did not ask Lena to have a seat. She did not have to. Lena understood this was not going to be a friendly chat. Lena Ashford, Catherine read, her voice flat and without any emotion. Entered the foster care system at age 3, placed with 4 different foster families over 13 years. Left the system at 16. Worked as a waitress at Rosie's Cafe in South Boston. From age 21 to 22. Left her job because of a pregnancy. Daughter, Phoebe Ashford, born at Boston Medical Center. Currently lives in apartment 312, Maple Building, Dorchester. Annual income is below the federal poverty line. She shut the file. Everything matches. Lena did not say a word. She reached into her apron, pocket, pulled out the coaster, and placed it on the desk next to the file. Catherine looked down at it, recognized the logo for Rosie's Cafe, and turned it over. She saw the name Lena, written in blue ink, and for the first time since Lena had walked into her home, Catherine Kensington's composure cracked. It was only for a moment. A blink that lasted too long, a slightly deeper breath, a swallow she tried to hide, but Lena saw it. "I found this in your son's room," Lena said quietly. "It was hidden behind a picture frame. That's my name, in my handwriting. He kept it for 5 years. Catherine did not touch the coaster. She just stared at it, as if it were the last piece of a puzzle she had refused to solve for half a decade. Then she leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the window where the Boston sky was shifting from red to a deep violet. 5 years ago, Catherine started, her voice completely changed. It was no longer cold and sharp, but low and heavy, like someone opening a box that had been sealed for far too long. Jude locked himself in his room for 3 days. He would not eat, he would not talk, he would not open the door for anyone, Not even for me." She turned her eyes back to Lena. When he finally came out, he said only one thing: "I have no reason left to stay." And then he agreed to take the position at the London branch, an offer he had turned down for 2 straight years. But that time, he accepted. He was on a flight that same week and has never come back. Catherine's hand settled on the coaster, her fingers gently grazing the name Lena, the same way her son, thousands of miles away in London, still did every single night before he went to sleep. I asked my husband, Raymond, if he knew what Jude had been through. He told me, no, I trusted him. She paused for a moment. Now, I realize he was lying. Catherine looked straight into Lena's eyes, her voice a strange mix of a command and a desperate plea. "Bring the girl to me tomorrow. I will know if she has Kensington blood." The bus trip back to Dorchester felt like it would never end. Lena leaned her forehead against the cool glass of the window in the very last row, watching Boston's scenery blur by without really seeing any of it. Streetlights began to pop on, their yellow glow smearing in her vision like stars falling upward into the night sky. Inside her apron pocket, her hand was clenched around her phone, as if it were the only thing proving that today's events were real and not some terrible waking nightmare. The bus finally pulled up to the corner of Maple and Adams. Lena got off, taking a deep breath of the familiar Dorchester twilight. The air was thick with the smell of fried food coming from the corner market. Hip-hop music drifted down from a fifth-floor window somewhere overhead. The sound of children laughing and shouting echoed from the little playground at the end of the street. She walked through the rusted iron gate of the Maple building and climbed 3 flights of stairs. The hallway lights above her flickered, looking like they were about to burn out for good. She passed the spot on the second floor where the wall was peeling, a problem she had reported back in March that no one had ever come to fix. But the moment she unlocked the door to apartment 312, the chaos of the outside world melted away. Her home was small and crowded, but every inch of it was filled with the life she and Phoebe shared. The refrigerator door was covered in Phoebe's artwork. Houses painted in impossible shades, flowers that were taller than people, and cats with wings soaring across purple skies. A small pot of mint sat on the windowsill. It was the only plant that had made it through the winter, all because Phoebe made a point of watering it each morning. The old sofa was draped with a patchwork blanket that Dolly had made. Every single fabric square held a story that the kind old woman would tell Phoebe on the nights she babysat. "Mama!" Phoebe shot out of the living room like a tiny cannonball. Her light brown hair was a mess, her fierce, familiar eyes were bright, and she was tightly clutching Biscuit, her stuffed bear that was so well loved it was missing an eye, but was still her most prized possession. Lena fell to her knees and pulled her daughter into a hug, squeezing her so tightly that Phoebe yelped, "Mama, I can't breathe!" But Lena couldn't let go. She breathed in the smell of baby shampoo from her daughter's hair and felt those tiny arms wrap around her neck. For the first time all day, Lena felt like she was standing on solid ground. Dolly stood in the doorway, her knitting needles clicking away, as she watched them with a warm smile. She was a good girl today. We even practiced counting to 100 in Spanish. "Thank you so much, Miss Dolly," Lena managed to say, keeping her voice from shaking. "You look exhausted," Dolly said, peering over her glasses. "First day with the rich folks must have been rough." "Rougher than I ever imagined," Lena admitted. It was probably the most honest thing she had said all day. After Dolly went home, Lena started making dinner. It was scrambled eggs with toast, a meal Phoebe called breakfast for dinner and always giggled about because it felt so wonderfully wrong. Lena sat at their little table, which was pushed up against the wall, and just watched her daughter eat. And suddenly, she noticed everything. She saw the way Phoebe tilted her head while she chewed, which was the exact same way Jude did in that old birthday photo. She saw how Phoebe held her glass of milk with her left hand, even though she was right-handed, just like Jack held his beer in the pictures. And then she saw the dimple. That little dimple that appeared when she laughed. It was a feature Lena always assumed came from some long-lost relative, but now it had a name, a face, and a portrait that hung on a living room wall in a mansion on Beacon Hill. Later that night, Phoebe was curled up in their shared bed, fast asleep, with Biscuit tucked under her chin. Her mouth was slightly open, and her breathing was soft and steady. Lena lay next to her, wide awake. She took out her phone, turned the brightness all the way down, and opened her photo gallery. She scrolled back in time, swiping past hundreds of photos of Phoebe, from the day she was born until now. She passed tired selfies taken after long night shifts and pictures of instant ramen eaten at 2 in the morning, back when Phoebe was just learning to roll over. And then she found them. There were only 4 pictures left from the happiest 3 months of her entire life. The first was a selfie they took in Boston Common when all the leaves were changing color. Jack's arm was wrapped around her, and they were both smiling, with the bright red maple trees glowing behind them. The second photo showed Jack in the kitchen of this very apartment, the same one where she had just made eggs. He was wearing a striped apron, had a smudge of tomato sauce on his cheek, and was grinning after he managed to burn a pot of instant noodles. The third picture was blurry and a little shaky because Lena had taken it so quickly. It was of Jack kissing her forehead in the rain at Faneuil Hall. You could see the raindrops shining in his hair, and his gray-blue eyes were closed. The fourth one was the last photo she ever took of him. Jack was asleep on her couch with one arm tucked under his head, his face looking so calm. Lena remembered thinking in that moment that she wanted to wake up next to that face every morning for the rest of her days. 2 days after she took that picture, he was gone. Lena switched off her phone and just stared at the ceiling. The crack was still there, a thin zigzag running from the corner toward the middle of the room. It looked exactly the same as it did almost 5 years ago when she lay in this very spot, 7 months pregnant and all alone, with no idea what to name her baby or how she would make the next month's rent. She remembered waking up at 3 in the morning to feed Phoebe, her eyes so heavy with sleep, but too scared to close them in case her daughter choked. She remembered going back to work the 8th month after Phoebe was born, while she was still nursing. She would leave her baby with Dolly from sunrise to sunset, only to come home and hold her, crying silently as the guilt just ate her alive. She remembered the night Phoebe was 8 months old and burning up with a 104-degree fever. Lena had run 6 blocks through the freezing cold, barefoot, to the emergency room at Boston Medical Center because she didn't have enough money in her wallet for a cab. She sang lullabies the whole way while her own tears soaked through her shirt. She hadn't cried once since that night. It wasn't because she was out of tears, but because she had learned that tears couldn't buy formula, or pay the rent, or make a sick child better. She couldn't afford to be weak. Phoebe needed her to be strong, and now, tomorrow, she had to take her 4-year-old daughter to a mansion she could never have dreamed of, to meet a grandmother she never knew existed, all to prove that the blood running through her daughter's veins connected her to a world that was millions of miles away from apartment 312 in the Maple Building. The next day, Lena got up early. She dressed Phoebe in her nicest floral dress and carefully combed her hair, even though Phoebe complained. "We are going to meet a lady at Mommy's job today," Lena explained, trying to sound as casual as possible. Phoebe looked up at her, her gray-blue eyes wide with curiosity. "Does she have any cookies?" Lena guided Phoebe around to the back of the enormous house, staying away from the front door, just as Catherine had told her to do the day before. A path made of slate stones wound its way through the southern garden, where the last of the season's hydrangeas were still showing a hint of pale purple before the Boston winter came to claim them completely. Phoebe walked right beside her mother, holding Lena's hand with one of her own and clutching Biscuit in the other. Her big, curious eyes were taking everything in with the kind of wonder that only a small child can have. "Mama, this house is really, really big," she whispered, as if she was afraid of being overheard. "Does somebody live in all of these rooms?" "Yes, they do, sweetie," Lena answered, her grip on her daughter's hand getting a little tighter. The guest house was located at the very back of the garden. It was a two-story building that was much smaller than the main house, but it was still at least 3 times bigger than their tiny apartment in Dorchester. Catherine Kensington was already there, waiting for them on the porch. She was dressed in a perfectly fitted cream-colored suit, with her platinum hair pulled back so tightly that not a single strand was out of place. Her posture was as straight as a ruler, but she wasn't even looking at Lena. Her gaze was locked on Phoebe from the second they appeared at the start of the path. She stared at the little girl with a focus so intense that Lena could feel it from 20 feet away. Phoebe could feel it too. She suddenly stopped walking, pulled on her mother's hand, and tried to hide behind Lena's leg, holding on tightly to her worn-out bear, more tightly. "Mommy," she whispered, her gray-blue eyes blinking. "That lady is looking at me strange." Lena placed a hand on her daughter's head, gently stroking her light brown hair. "It will be okay, honey. She is just curious about you." Catherine had heard Phoebe's quiet words, and Lena watched the older woman take a deep breath before coming down the porch steps. She approached with slow, measured steps, as if any sudden movement might scare the little girl. When she was just a couple of feet away, she stopped. She lowered herself slightly, not quite kneeling. Catherine Kensington did not kneel for anyone, but just enough to be closer to Phoebe's level. "Hello?" she said, her voice softer than Lena had ever imagined. It was so gentle that it was hard to believe it belonged to the same woman who had confronted her in the living room just yesterday. "You must be Phoebe." Phoebe gave a small nod, staying partly shielded by her mother's leg, but her curious eyes peeked out from behind Lena's hip. "Do you have any cookies?" Catherine blinked, and then a genuine smile spread across her face, a sight Lena suspected very few people had ever witnessed. "I certainly do," she replied. "I have a whole plate of them. Why do not you come inside, and I can give you one?" Inside the guest house, the living room felt cozier than Lena had anticipated. A floral sofa sat in the middle of the room with white lace curtains on the windows. On the coffee table, a tray held freshly baked, golden cookies next to a pitcher of apple juice and 3 glasses, 2 large and 1 small. Catherine had prepared everything so thoughtfully, and that spoke volumes to Lena. The moment Phoebe saw the cookies, all her shyness vanished. She looked up at her mother, asking for permission with her eyes. Lena nodded, and Phoebe scrambled onto the edge of the sofa, choosing a cookie with great care and taking a tiny bite. Her eyes widened with delight. "This is so good," she announced with a huge grin. A dimple appeared on her plump cheek, deep and impossible to miss. It was identical in every way to the one in the birthday picture of Jude that Lena had been looking at in an album the night before. Catherine raised a hand to her chest, her fingers clutching the fabric of her suit right over her heart. Lena could see her knuckles turn white. "Jude loved these when he was a boy," Catherine said, her voice unsteady. It was the first time Lena had ever heard it tremble. The phrase, "when he was a boy," escaped her lips, filled with the weight of 40 years of memories. Mrs. Cook made them every Sunday. He would always grab the biggest one and hide it in his coat pocket to take to his room. Phoebe was too young to grasp the history behind those words, but she felt the kindness in the older woman's voice. She held out her half-eaten cookie as an offering. "Would you like a bite? It is very yummy." Catherine gently shook her head, though the smile remained on her lips. Her eyes were moist with tears, and she made no effort to wipe them away. Perhaps she simply could not. After finishing a second cookie, Phoebe became more adventurous. She began to explore the living room, feeling the texture of the sofa, looking at the vase on the windowsill. Then she remembered the small backpack she had brought with her. "Mommy, can I show her my drawing book?" Lena's heart began to beat a little faster as she nodded. She knew exactly what was in that book. Phoebe unzipped her backpack and took out a well-loved sketchbook, its cover decorated with stickers of stars and cats. She climbed onto the sofa next to Catherine with a casualness that surprised both women and opened the book. The pages were filled with a child's crayon drawings, a house with smoke spiraling from the chimney, flowers as big as the page, and a smiling sun. Catherine turned each page, nodding and offering soft compliments, until Phoebe came to a specific drawing and stopped. "This one is my favorite," she announced, with the seriousness only a 4-year-old can have. The picture showed 3 figures holding hands. The smallest one in the center had brown hair and a floral dress. It was clearly Phoebe. To the left stood a taller figure with long hair, labeled Mommy. On the right was the tallest figure, drawn more simply with short hair, standing slightly apart from the other two, as if the young artist was not sure how close he should be. "This is Mommy, this is me, and this," Phoebe said, pointing to the figure on the right, "is Daddy." Catherine stared at the drawing and then looked at Phoebe. "Is your daddy very far away?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Phoebe nodded with a solemn expression. "Very far, but Mommy says Daddy loves me. He just had to go somewhere for a long time." Catherine's eyes met Lena's. All the coldness, the sharpness, and the suspicion from the day before were gone. In their place was something much more complicated, an emotion that took Lena a moment to identify. It was respect, because Lena had taught her daughter that her father loved her, not to resent him. It was pain, because she was looking at a 4-year-old granddaughter she should have known from her very first breath. And it was shame, a profound shame that comes only from a guilty conscience, as she started to realize her family had deprived this child of something that no amount of cookies or mansions could ever give back. Suddenly, the ringing of a phone broke the silence. Catherine pulled it from her pocket, glanced at the screen, and her entire demeanor changed instantly. She stood up, muttered, "Please excuse me," and stepped out onto the porch, shutting the door behind her. Lena could just make out her voice through the glass, quiet but firm. "When? Tomorrow morning." "Fine. No, do not question it. Just get back here." When Catherine came back inside, her calm expression had returned, but a new stress was visible around her eyes. "There has been a change of plans," she said, her gaze fixed on Lena. "Jude has moved up his flight. He is arriving tomorrow morning." Lena felt the world spin. Tomorrow morning. Not over the weekend. Not next week. Tomorrow. "I am not ready," she confessed, the words escaping before she could hold them back, more truthful than anything she had said in the past 2 days. Catherine looked at her for a long moment. Then her eyes shifted to Phoebe, who was now busy adding another yellow flower to her family portrait, completely oblivious to how her life was about to be turned upside down. "No one is ever ready for something like this," Catherine said, her voice low. It was not cold, but it was heavy, like the voice of someone carrying a great weight on her shoulders. "But my son has already lost 5 years. He will not lose another day." More than 5,000 miles away, in a 6th-floor suite at Claridge's in the center of London, Jude Kensington sat by a window staring down at the midnight streets of Mayfair. A light rain misted the glass, with tiny droplets making their way down the pane like roads he had never taken. The whiskey glass on the marble ledge beside him was empty, with just a faint amber residue at the bottom and the lingering aroma of peat smoke in the room. Next to it, on the cold stone, was a small, round piece of cardboard with frayed edges. It was a pale brown coaster from a place called Rosie's Cafe, so old it was almost falling apart. Jude picked it up and turned it over, looking at the slanted handwriting in blue ink. It was slightly faded, but still perfectly clear. "Lena." He ran his thumb over her name, his touch so gentle it was as if he feared pressing too hard would make it vanish. Just like the woman with that name had vanished from his life. No, not vanished. He had been the one to push her away, telling himself it was for her own protection. The door opened. Brennan entered without knocking, a right he had earned after 10 years by Jude's side, through tense negotiations in dimly lit rooms, long nights without sleep, and choices most men would never have to face. He noticed the coaster in Jude's hand, but showed no surprise. This was not the first time he had seen it, nor the 10th, nor even the 100th. "Boss, your mother called," Brennan stated plainly. She wants you on an earlier flight home tomorrow morning. Jude did not look up. Did she give a reason? She did not. She just said it was important, and that she needed you back home right away. Jude stayed quiet, his eyes still on the coaster. Brennan stood with his arms crossed, watching his boss with the patience of a man who had seen it all. He let out a soft, barely audible sigh. "It has been 5 years, boss," Brennan said. His tone was not accusatory, just weary, like someone who had said the same thing too many times, already knowing the response. "You need to let it go." Jude finally raised his head. His gray-blue eyes, the same ones that a 4-year-old child an ocean away shared without his knowledge, met Brennan's with a quiet sorrow. "I have let go of everything else in my life, Brennan," he said, his voice quiet and measured. "I let go of my dream to be an architect when my father told me my place was at the head of the boardroom table. I gave up the right to my own life the day I inherited the Kensington name. I even let go of the only woman who ever looked at me without seeing money, power, or fear." His gaze returned to the coaster in his hand. "But this is the one thing I cannot let go of." Brennan did not say another word. He had realized a long time ago that some battles were not meant to be won, and the coaster with Lena's name on it was one of them. Jude stood up and slid the coaster into the inner pocket of his jacket, on the left side, directly over his heart. The exact place it had been for 5 years. It had been there through every board meeting, every stuffy, formal dinner, and every long, silent night in his London suite. "Book the flight for tomorrow morning," Jude instructed as he walked past Brennan to the closet and started to pack. Brennan nodded and pulled out his phone. But before he turned away, he glanced back one last time at his employer. The most powerful mafia boss on the East Coast was carefully folding shirts into a suitcase with the same hands that, just 12 hours before, had signed off on a $200 million deal. Brennan wondered if fate was playing a cruel trick or if something new was just beginning, now that Catherine Kensington had unexpectedly called her son home. Him as a person, not an employer. The bus dropped her on Beacon Hill at 7:45. The second she walked through the estate's iron gates, she knew something was different. A polished black Audi sat parked right in front of the main entrance. That car was not there 2 days ago. He was back. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm she could feel in her throat. She walked directly to the front door, ignoring the service entrance she was supposed to use. Mrs. Patton answered, her eyes briefly widening when she saw Lena in the black dress instead of her uniform. But she said nothing, just tilted her head and moved aside, as if she already knew this morning was going to be anything but normal. Lena's low heels clicked against the marble floor of the foyer, the sound echoing through the grand space. She moved down the hallway she had already memorized, walking past expensive oil paintings and under shimmering crystal chandeliers. She finally stopped at the tall oak double doors of the main living room. A man's voice, deep and steady, was coming from inside. Her whole body went rigid, a shock of ice water flooding her veins. She had not heard that voice in 5 years. She had convinced herself she had forgotten it. She was wrong. Lena knocked. "Come in," Catherine's voice called out. It was calm, but stretched thin, like a wire about to snap. Lena pushed the heavy door open. Inside, Catherine was sitting in her usual armchair to the left of the fireplace. Her back was perfectly straight, and her hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. To the right of the fireplace, a tall man in a gray suit stood with his back to the door. He held a coffee cup in one hand, while the other was tucked casually into his pants pocket. He was talking to his mother, his voice relaxed and warm. He sounded like a man who had just come home after a long trip, completely unaware that the world he left behind had fundamentally changed. And then he turned around, and time itself seemed to freeze. It was those eyes, the same haunting, unforgettable eyes she had never been able to forget. 5 years had etched new lines onto his face, making him look harder, more weary. There were hints of silver starting to appear at his temples, and his jaw was set tight, like a man who grinds his teeth at night. But his eyes were exactly the same. They were the eyes she had stared into every single morning for 3 months straight, and they were the eyes she had seen every day since, looking back at her from her own daughter's face. The coffee cup in Jude's hand tipped, almost crashing to the floor. He managed to catch it, but a few dark drops of hot coffee splashed onto his skin. He didn't even seem to feel the burn. His entire body had gone completely stiff. The only part of him that moved were his eyes, which were wide and blinking fast, as if his brain was refusing to accept what he was seeing. "Lena," he whispered. Her name was a hoarse sound, barely a word, more like a gasp of air forced from a constricted throat. It was as if just saying her name had sucked all the oxygen out of the room. Lena just stood there, her arms hanging straight at her sides. Her back was rigid, and her gaze was locked on his. She had spent the entire night playing this moment over and over in her head, rehearsing exactly what she would say. But now, seeing him standing right there in front of her, every single practiced line disappeared from her mind. All that was left was the truth. "Hello, Jack," she said, her voice much steadier than she felt. Then she corrected herself. "Or maybe I should say Jude Kensington, the mob boss whose real name I never even knew." Jude placed his coffee cup on the fireplace mantel. His hand was shaking so badly that it clattered against the marble. He shot a look at his mother, pure panic flashing across the face of one of the most powerful men on the East Coast. In that single moment, he looked like a little boy who had just been caught red-handed. "Mother," he stammered, his voice cracking. "What is going on here?" Catherine didn't get up. She didn't even shift in her chair. Her expression remained completely unchanged. She just looked at her son with the cold eyes of a woman who had been preparing for this confrontation for 2 full days. Then she spoke, her voice so calm it was almost cruel. She sounded as if she were simply giving a weather report, as if the words she was about to say had no power to destroy everything and everyone in that room. "You have a daughter, Jude. She is 4 years old. Her name is Phoebe." A profound silence filled the room. It wasn't an awkward silence, or a thoughtful one. It was the silence that hangs in the air after a bomb has been dropped, but before it hits its target. That single suspended second where everything is still whole, but everyone knows it is about to be shattered into a million pieces. Jude stared at his mother, then at Lena, then back to his mother again. His mouth hung open, but no words came out. His right hand fumbled behind him until it found the arm of a chair, and he grabbed onto it for support, his fingers turning white. All the color drained from his face, so much so that Lena could see the faint blue veins throbbing at his temple. And those gray-blue eyes, the same ones that had looked out over Mayfair with such familiar loneliness just 12 hours before, were now wide with an emotion far beyond simple surprise. It was pure, primal shock. The kind of shock that makes your body forget how to breathe, how to move, how to exist. "Daughter," Jude repeated, the word falling from his lips like a heavy stone. 4 years. Catherine gave a single firm nod. "The woman standing before you is the child's mother. She came to this house looking for work. She recognized your portrait on the wall. I have spent the last 2 days confirming every detail. Her story is true." Jude whipped his head back to Lena, his eyes desperately searching her face for some sign of denial. He was hoping, praying, that this was all just some horrible mistake. Lena gave him no such comfort. She stood tall, her arms still at her sides, and she began to speak. Her voice was steady and cool. There were no tears, no trembling, and no begging for sympathy. "I found out I was pregnant 6 weeks after you vanished," she said. "I tried to find you. The phone number you gave me was disconnected. No one at the cafe had ever heard of you. All I had was a fake name and a handful of memories. I gave birth all by myself at Boston Medical Center. There was no one there to hold my hand." She paused, not for emotional effect, but just to take a breath. "I have raised Phoebe on my own from her very first day. I worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. There were months I couldn't afford formula, so I just didn't eat to make sure she had enough. When Phoebe was 8 months old, she spiked a fever of 104 degrees in the middle of the night. I ran 6 blocks to the emergency room in my bare feet because I didn't have enough money for a cab. Each sentence was like a knife, and Lena knew it. But she wasn't trying to be cruel. She was just telling him the facts. And the facts themselves were brutal enough. I didn't come here looking for you, she finished, her voice perfectly even. I had no idea who you really were until I saw that painting. I took this job because the pay is 3 times what I made at the cafe, and my daughter needs to eat. It is as simple as that. At some point during her story, Jude had collapsed into the armchair. He was bent over, his elbows on his knees and his hands clutching his head. His shoulders were shaking slightly. When he finally looked up, his gray-blue eyes were red and swimming with unshed tears. I didn't know, he said, his voice completely broken. Lena, I swear to you, I did not know. If I had known... What would you have done? Lena asked. Her tone wasn't bitter. She was genuinely curious. Jude looked at her, then stared down at his own hands, as if the answer was written there on his palms. Then, he finally spoke. My father found out about us, he began, his voice dropping low, becoming heavy with the weight of a secret he had buried for 5 long years. Raymond Kensington does not like surprises. He had you followed. He knew everything about you. He knew where you lived, where you worked, every move you made. Then he called me into his office. Jude swallowed hard. He told me I had to end it with you immediately. I told him no. The very next day you were fired from Rosie's. Lena flinched. She remembered that morning perfectly, how the owner had called her into the back kitchen, how he couldn't even look her in the eye when he told her about staff cuts. His voice had been shaky, and she had believed him. She just thought she was another unlucky person losing her job. My father bought the entire building that the cafe was in, Jude went on, forcing the words through his clenched teeth, just so he could have the power to fire you. And then he told me, this is just step 1. If you don't do as I say, the next step will not be so pleasant. I know my father, Lena. He does not make empty threats. He has the money, the connections, and the cold-blooded willingness to follow through. Jude's voice broke completely on the last part. I left because I was terrified he was going to hurt you. I thought if I just disappeared, he would leave you alone. I thought it was the only way I could keep you safe. Catherine spoke up then, her voice quiet but firm. Raymond is a man from a different time, she said, looking out the window as the morning sun streamed in. To him, bloodlines and status are everything. I am not making excuses for my husband. I just want you to understand that Jude did not make his choice under normal circumstances. Lena stood there and listened. She took in every word, every painful detail, and inside her, 2 powerful emotions were swirling, like 2 rivers running side by side that could never possibly mix. One of those feelings was rage, a deep, burning anger she had been carrying for 5 kitchen. He could not look at her, explaining it was about budget cuts. His voice was shaky, and she had taken his word for it, believing she was just another unfortunate soul on a downsizing list. Jude went on, every word sounding like it was being ripped from him. My father purchased the whole building, including the cafe you leased, all just to get rid of you. Then he told me, this is just the beginning. If you refuse to listen, the next move will not be so civil. I know my father, Lena. He does not bluff. He has the influence, the resources, and the cold heart to follow through. The next words he spoke were choked with emotion. I left you because I was terrified he would come after you. I figured if I was gone, he would have no reason to bother you. I believed it was the only way I could keep you safe. Catherine then added her thoughts, her voice low and serious. Raymond is from a different time, she said, her gaze drifting to the window where the morning sun poured through the large panes. To him, lineage is what matters most. Social standing is what matters most. I am not making excuses for my husband. I just need you to see that Jude was not thinking clearly when he made his choice. Lena took it all in. She processed every word, every single detail, and deep inside her, two powerful feelings fought for control, like a pair of rivers destined to never join. The first was rage, a rage she had held on to for 5 years. Rage at the man who had simply disappeared, leaving her all alone. The other was a painful recognition, the awful truth that he had not walked away because his love had faded, but because his love was too strong, and so was his fear. That single realization stung more than any anger ever had. You took that choice away from me, Lena said, her own voice now starting to shake. It was a genuine tremor. The clash between her anger and her newfound understanding was tearing her in two. You made the decision for me that being abandoned was the only way to protect me. You convinced yourself that walking away was some kind of heroic sacrifice. But do you have any idea what that sacrifice did to me, to our daughter? Jude offered no reply. He just stared at her, his gray-blue eyes filled with a deep sorrow. This was not the cheap regret of a man who was caught. It was the kind that eats you alive from the inside, the kind he had lived with every single day and night in his London apartment, right next to the coaster that had her name on it. Phoebe, he murmured, her name shattering into pieces as he spoke it. Can I please see her? Lena examined him for a very long time. She looked into those shimmering gray-blue eyes, the very same ones that greeted her each morning from her daughter's face when she asked about breakfast. She looked at the trembling hands of the most feared syndicate leader on the entire East Coast. She looked at the man who had shattered her heart into a million pieces, yet had also blessed her with the greatest treasure of her entire life. Yes, Lena finally said. But if you vanish on us again, Jude Kensington, I do not care who you are or how much power you think you have. I promise you will not be getting a third chance. Jude drove with his eyes locked on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard that his knuckles turned white. Lena sat beside him in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap as she gazed out the window. An absolute silence hung between them. The city of Boston drifted by, from the quaint brick streets of Beacon Hill to the sprawling avenues of downtown, before shifting into neighborhoods that were older, grittier, and more real. 10 minutes went by, filled only with the low drone of the car's engine and the faint sound of distant traffic. For 10 minutes, every second felt stretched out and heavy as both of them sat there battling their own demons. Lena was the one who finally spoke, not out of desire, but because the silence was becoming too much to bear. She is an artist, she said gently, her eyes still on the world outside, just like you were. For the first time since they had left, Jude turned to look at her. Like me. You would not know, Lena answered. But Phoebe spends all day drawing houses, all sorts of them. Houses with big yards, houses with tall chimneys, houses with balconies overflowing with flowers. She draws houses so much that her preschool teacher even asked me once if I was an architect. She took a breath. She draws them as if she is looking for a place to call home, but she has not found it yet. Jude did not respond. He turned his attention back to the road, but Lena could see the muscle in his jaw flexing beneath his skin. When the Audi made the turn onto Maple Street, he eased off the gas. He stared through the windshield at the apartment building, at the rusted gate, the fractured concrete steps, the grimy exterior covered in graffiti, and the clothesline stretched between balconies on the 4th floor. This was his daughter's home. This was the place where, while he was living in a luxury suite at Claridge's with a view of Mayfair, Phoebe was sleeping in a cramped apartment, sharing a bed with her mother and holding on to a tattered stuffed bear named Biscuit. I do not feel pity, Jude said in a low voice as he cut the engine, his eyes still fixed on the building. I feel ashamed. Lena did not say a word. She simply pushed her door open and got out of the car. Jude did the same. They walked up 3 flights of stairs without a word, passing by flickering lights in the hallway, sections of peeling plaster, and the heavy smell of something being fried that was coming from an apartment on the second floor. Jude never complained or even winced. He just watched, his eyes absorbing every single detail, mentally cataloging every hardship his daughter had been forced to live with for 4 years, all because of him. Lena rapped on Dolly's apartment door. When it swung open, before Lena could even say hello, a whirlwind of brown hair and energy shot out. "Mama!" Phoebe threw her arms around her mother's leg, her little face turned upward, her gray-blue eyes sparkling. And then she noticed Jude. She froze, cocking her head to the side, a gesture so perfectly mimicking Jude's own when he was sizing up a problem, the same exact way she had looked at Catherine. Her inquisitive eyes scanned him from his shiny leather shoes all the way up to his face, where they locked onto his eyes. 2 identical sets of eyes met, like a reflection showing 2 entirely different worlds. Then Phoebe ducked behind her mother's leg, her grip tightening on her one-eyed teddy bear. "Mama," she whispered, "I do not like new people." Lena placed a comforting hand on her daughter's hair. "It is all right, sweetie." She gave Jude a look, and he knew what she meant. He took 1 step back, and then another, to give the little girl some room. He did not move forward or get down on her level to try and talk to her. He did not do any of the things a less patient person might have. He just stood there and gave her time. Over in a corner of Dolly's living room, a small art table was set up. Phoebe went back to her spot, pulled out her box of crayons, and started to draw, completely ignoring Jude as though he was not even there. Jude looked over at Lena. She gave him the tiniest shake of her head, a clear signal not to force it. He gave a slight nod in return, and then he made a move that took Lena completely by surprise. He found a small chair, pulled it up to the table next to Phoebe, grabbed a clean sheet of paper and a couple of crayons, and started to draw. He did not say anything or even look at her. He just drew. He sketched a house with perfect lines and balanced features, complete with a pillared porch, large windows, and inviting steps. There he was, a feared crime lord, crammed onto a child's plastic chair in a Dorchester apartment, creating the most magnificent house that could possibly be made with wax crayons. Phoebe peeked at him from the corner of her eye. She tried to act like he was not there, but a 4-year-old's curiosity is a powerful thing. She looked again, and then again. Finally, she gave up pretending and just stared. "Whose house is that?" she asked, her voice cautious but filled with interest. Jude gently looked up. "I am not sure yet. I just enjoy drawing houses." "I enjoy drawing houses too," Phoebe declared. And with that, the very first connection between a father and his daughter was formed. A bond as light as a whisper, but stronger than any deal Jude had ever closed. She scooted her chair a little bit closer, and then a little bit more. She opened her own drawing pad to a specific page and laid it on the table between them. It showed 3 stick figures holding hands. Mama, Phoebe, and a third person standing off to the side, drawn with simple lines and short hair. "Who is this one?" Jude asked, his voice barely a whisper. "That is my daddy," Phoebe replied with great seriousness. "Mama says, Daddy had to go very far away, but I still draw him anyway." Jude had to turn his head away. A tremor ran through his broad shoulders. And Lena, watching from across the room, saw him raise a hand to his face as if to wipe away sweat. But it was not sweat. The most feared man on the East Coast was shedding tears over a simple drawing made by a 4-year-old girl. Then Phoebe added in a soft voice, with the kind of brutal honesty only a child has, "Tommy has a daddy. Maya has a daddy. All the kids have a daddy." She looked down at her picture. "I do not." The silence in the room became so thick it was hard to breathe. And then Phoebe did something that no one saw coming. She gently tore the drawing out of her sketchbook, carefully smoothed it out on the table, and then held it up to Jude with both of her small hands. "This is for you," she said, her tone very grave, "because you seem sad." Jude accepted the piece of paper with both of his hands. These were hands that had signed deals worth millions of dollars, hands that had held firm during life or death situations, hands that commanded an entire underground network. Now they were holding a thin piece of paper with a crayon drawing on it, as if it was the most delicate and priceless object he had ever held. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice cracking completely on just those two words. "This is the most wonderful thing I have ever received from anyone." During the drive back in the black Audi, the drawing lay on Jude's lap. He was completely silent for 5 whole minutes. Lena also kept quiet, giving him the time and space that he so clearly needed. Finally, Jude spoke, his voice low and firm. It was no longer broken, but had been forged into a new resolve, tougher than any metal and more profound than any regret. "I have already lost 4 years," he said, his eyes focused on the road stretching out before them. "I will not waste another single day." Jude was true to his promise. He showed up again the following day, and the day after that, and every day that followed. An entire month went by, and Jude Kensington never once missed a visit. He was never a minute late, even if it meant ducking out of a board meeting, rescheduling a call with his partners in London, or fighting his way through Boston's rush hour traffic to get to the Dorchester apartment at 4 o'clock, right on the dot. At first, Phoebe still referred to him as Uncle Jude, and made sure to keep a safe distance between them, always using Biscuit as a fluffy little barrier. But children have their own methods for judging a person's character, and their senses are far more accurate than anything an adult could come up with. Phoebe checked his sincerity with a child's patience. She saw it in how Jude never made her speak when she preferred to be quiet. He always sat on the floor, not a chair, so they could look at each other at eye level. He remembered that she liked purple crayons more than blue ones, and that her teddy bear, Biscuit, needed his very own chair when it was time for cookies. Slowly, the distance between them closed. The worn-out stuffed animal went from being a shield to being a shared friend. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, Jude sat with his legs crossed on the old rug of their Dorchester apartment. He was wearing a $3,000 suit and playing with a plastic toy tea set right across from Phoebe. The teddy bear, their silent guest of honor, had his own seat with a little pink cup set before him. Phoebe poured imaginary tea into Jude's cup with the seriousness of a perfect hostess. "Here is your tea," she announced. "I didn't put sugar in it because you said you do not like sugar." Jude took a sip from the tiny cup with the same focused look he had when signing deals in front of a boardroom. "This is excellent," he declared. "You make a better cup than Brennan." Phoebe erupted in laughter, her dimples showing, and Lena, standing in the kitchen doorway with her coffee mug, had to bite her lip to keep the overwhelming emotion inside her from spilling out. And then came that day. It started out as a completely unremarkable day, just a normal Saturday afternoon. Jude was taking Phoebe and Lena to the grocery store because Phoebe was determined to get a chocolate cereal that her mom never bought, saying it was too expensive. They were making their way down an aisle, with Phoebe sitting in the shopping cart, her legs dangling and swinging as her eyes searched the colorful boxes on the shelves. She finally saw it high up on the top shelf, the cereal box with the cartoon rabbit she loved, placed just out of her reach and her mother's. Without a second thought, without even a pause, Phoebe looked toward the tallest person near her and said, "Daddy, can you get that for me?" Jude froze right there in the middle of the aisle. His hand was already stretching up, his fingers just touching the box, and he just stayed there, like a statue caught in mid-motion. His eyes instantly filled with tears. It happened so fast that Lena knew he had no time to prepare himself, to put up his defenses, to wear his mafia boss mask. There he stood in a busy supermarket, holding a cereal box with a rabbit on it, his eyes glistening, as the word "daddy" echoed in his head. It was like a bell that he never knew he had been waiting his whole life to hear. "Daddy," Phoebe said again, confused by why he had stopped moving. "I want that one." Jude swallowed hard, blinked his eyes, and gently placed the box into the cart. "Here you are, princess," he said. His voice was a little shaky, but his smile was the biggest Lena had ever witnessed. Back at the Beacon Hill mansion, Catherine Kensington was also going through her own transformation. Every weekend, Phoebe would visit the estate, and the iron-willed matriarch, who had ruled an underground empire with her husband for 40 years, would now be sitting on the living room floor, playing dolls with her granddaughter. She showed Phoebe how to make things with clay and told her stories about Jude when he was a little boy. For the first time in ages, the sound of a child's laughter filled rooms that had long been heavy with the silence of power and secrets. Brennan was the first one to see the shift in his boss. One evening, Jude was leaving the Dorchester apartment after putting Phoebe to bed with a story. Brennan was waiting by the car and saw his employer walking toward him with a smile still on his face. "You seem different, boss," Brennan remarked. Jude just looked at him. "The way you smile," Brennan explained, his tone not of accusation, but of genuine surprise. "I have worked for you for 10 years. I have never seen you smile that way." Jude did not reply, but he was aware that Brennan was right. He started to turn down certain kinds of meetings, the ones that were never on any official schedule, the ones that took place in the basements of restaurants or the back rooms of clubs, the very meetings he used to consider essential. He started to hand off his responsibilities, one by one, like a man carefully taking apart a tower he had spent 15 years building, starting from the very top, slowly but with absolute resolve. And on the refrigerator in the Dorchester apartment, in the most important spot, a new drawing from Phoebe was held up by a flower-shaped magnet. It showed 3 people holding hands. Mama was on the left, Phoebe was in the middle, and then there was Daddy. This time, he was not standing off in a far corner, no longer just a faint pencil sketch at the edge of the paper. This time, Daddy stood right beside them, holding his daughter's hand and holding Mama's hand. He was drawn big and clear and solid, colored in with the darkest black crayon in the whole box. It was as if Phoebe was trying to make absolutely sure that this time, Daddy was not going to disappear. The picnic was Jude's idea. He brought it up on a Friday night while the 3 of them were sitting on the floor of the Dorchester apartment, eating pizza because their table was not big enough for all of them. Phoebe had already announced it was the best pizza party ever, even though it was just a $12 pizza from the shop on the corner. "The weather is supposed to be good tomorrow," Jude said, looking over at Lena. "Walden Pond, the 3 of us. If you agree." Lena paused for a moment. This would be the first time they had gone out as a real family. Not in the familiar comfort of the apartment or inside the secure walls of the mansion, but out in the open world, where anyone could see them and think they were just like any other family. "Okay," she finally said. On Saturday morning, their black Audi drove out of Boston and headed west. Phoebe was buckled into the car seat that Jude had purchased the week before, with Biscuit on her lap, and she was talking non-stop. She told them all about a boy at her preschool named Tommy who had lost a front tooth. She talked about her teacher, Miss Teresa, showing her how to paint butterflies using her fingers. She explained how her doll, Dolly, was knitting a wool hat for Biscuit because winter was on its way, and bears get cold too. Daddy Jude drove the car, glancing in the rearview mirror to watch his daughter. He answered every single one of her questions, nodding his head at the right times and pretending to be surprised when he needed to be. And Lena sat in the passenger seat, watching both of them in that same mirror. She felt a warmth spreading inside her chest, a feeling she was not yet brave enough to give a name to. Then, right in the middle of her story about the butterflies, Phoebe suddenly asked, as casually as if she were asking about the sky, "Daddy, why were you not with Mama in the very beginning?" A complete silence suddenly filled the car, feeling like a heavy blanket. Lena felt herself stop breathing. Her hands tightened their grip on the seat. In the mirror, she could see Jude's hands clench the steering wheel. His jaw was set, but he did not avoid her question. He did not try to change the subject. He did not say, "You will understand when you are older," like most adults would have. "Because Daddy did something very, very wrong," Jude said slowly and carefully, like a man testing his first step on thin ice. Daddy thought that if he went away, it would keep Mama safe, but it just made Mama sad. And because of that, Daddy missed a lot of time with you. Phoebe was quiet for a moment, thinking it over in the unique way that only a 4-year-old can. Then she said, "But Daddy is here now." "Yes," Jude replied, his voice filled with emotion. "Daddy is here now. And Daddy is not going away ever again." "Right. Never, ever. Pinky promise." Jude looked into the rearview mirror. Phoebe was holding up her tiny little finger with great seriousness. As if it were the most important promise in the world, he reached his right hand back toward her, her little finger hooked around his own bigger, rougher finger wrapping around hers with a gentleness that only a father can show his child. "Pinky promise," Jude said. Walden Pond on an autumn morning was so gorgeous it almost looked like a painting. The lake was perfectly still, reflecting the blue sky and the trees that were changing from green to gold and fiery red. The air felt crisp and pure, and it smelled of damp leaves and rich earth. They spread out Dolly's patchwork blanket under a large oak tree near the edge of the water. Then they set out the food that Jude had picked up from a deli on their way there. There were sandwiches, fruit, juice, and a box of cookies that Phoebe had insisted on bringing because, as she said, "These are the kind that Grandma Catherine gives me. They are the best." After they finished eating, Phoebe took out the watercolor paint set Jude had given her the week before. She sat at the edge of the blanket and began to paint the lake. She was completely focused on her work, with her head bent down and the tip of her tongue sticking out in concentration. The two adults sat leaning against the trunk of the oak tree, their shoulders close but not quite touching, just watching her. "Lena," Jude said, and the tone of his voice had shifted. It was no longer the voice of a daddy talking to his little girl. It was the voice of a man talking to the woman he loved, low and with a slight tremble. "I want a second chance." Lena did not turn to look at him. She kept her eyes on Phoebe, who was mixing blue and white paint to get the color of the water just right. "It is not just because of Phoebe," Jude went on. "Even though she is the most important reason, it is because of us. Because whatever we had between us never really went away." He paused for a moment, then added in a quieter voice, almost as if he were talking to himself. 5 years, Lena. 5 years. I kept that coaster with your name on it in my jacket pocket. I carried it with me from Boston to London, and I put it on my nightstand every single night. Brennan thinks I am crazy." He managed a small, sad smile. "Maybe I am. But I met so many people during those 5 years, and not a single one of them was you." Lena finally turned her head to face him. His gray-blue eyes met hers, and they were filled with complete honesty. There was no mafia armor, no protective walls. There was only the man she had fallen in love with 5 years ago, sitting with her under an oak tree by a lake, asking her for another chance. "I am scared," she admitted, speaking more honestly than she ever had before. "I am scared of your world, Jude. It is so dangerous. It took you away from me once before. It could do it again. Or even worse, it could find a way to hurt Phoebe." Jude did not try to argue with her or make any grand promises he could not keep. He did not offer her empty words of comfort. He just said, "Do not believe what I say. Watch what I do. I will prove it to you, every single day." Before Lena had a chance to reply, Phoebe came running over to them, holding up her painting, which was still a little wet, her eyes shining with excitement. "Look," she exclaimed, holding it up between them. It showed a blue lake and trees of red and gold. And right in the middle there were 3 figures standing right next to each other at the water's edge. It was not like her old drawings, where 3 people held hands but Daddy was far off in the corner. This time, the 3 of them stood shoulder to shoulder, and right above them, written in shaky letters, was the one word Phoebe had just learned to spell: family. Lena glanced from the drawing to Phoebe and then to Jude. With slow and deliberate care, she laid her hand on top of his. It was the first time in 5 long years she had made the first move. She whispered, "One step at a time," her voice soft but sure. "Together." Jude flipped his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. They sat there under the oak tree, watching Phoebe chase a late autumn butterfly toward the lake, her drawing of their family resting on the patchwork blanket between them. Later, on the ride home, Phoebe was fast asleep in her car seat, a half-eaten cookie tucked beneath her chin. Her lips were slightly parted, her breathing calm and rhythmic. The Audi moved smoothly down the highway as the Boston skyline appeared, painted in the violet and red of twilight. Lena and Jude's hands were still linked together over the center console. Neither of them said a word. They did not have to. For the first time in 5 years, the silence that filled the space between them was not heavy with loss or anger or loneliness. It was a silence of peace, the sound of two people who had finally found their way back to one another. The week after the picnic, everything was so perfect that Lena started to get scared. Not the familiar fear of not having enough or of being alone, which she had gotten used to over the years, but a new fear of being happy. She was scared because every morning, the moment the doorbell rang, Phoebe would yell, "Daddy!" and hurl herself at Jude's legs like a tiny rocket, her smile stretched as wide as it could go. Lena knew that if that smile ever disappeared, it would shatter Phoebe in a way that 4 years without a father never could have. This time, her daughter knew exactly what she would be losing. She was scared because every morning, Lena would make Jude his coffee, black with no sugar, and place it on the small kitchen table. He would take that first sip and look at her with those gray-blue eyes that had captivated her 5 years ago, and she could feel herself falling for him all over again. She was scared because Catherine Kensington, the family's iron-willed matriarch, invited all three of them for dinner in the main dining room of the Beacon Hill mansion. They were not hidden in the guest house or tucked away in a private corner. They were seated at the head table, the same one used for every important Kensington dinner for the last half-century. Phoebe sat in a high chair that Catherine had bought just for her, with her teddy bear Biscuit in the seat right next to her because Phoebe insisted the bear needed a spot too. And Catherine did not raise a single protest. It was an acceptance that was more powerful than any official announcement could ever be. Everything was perfect, and Lena was terrified, because life had always taught her that beautiful things do not last. Then she noticed the sport utility vehicle. She first saw it on Tuesday, when she was picking Phoebe up from Pano Solis preschool. A black sport utility vehicle with tinted windows was parked on the other side of the street, about 100 feet from the entrance. At first, Lena did not think much about it. Boston was filled with black vehicles with tinted windows. But on Thursday, when she got there, the same vehicle was in the exact same spot, with the same license plate. This time, the driver rolled the window down just a crack, enough for Lena to see a man's face staring right at the preschool gate, where Phoebe was running out and hugging her favorite stuffed animal. Lena held her daughter's hand a little tighter and began walking faster, her heart hammering in her chest. She told herself she was overreacting, that it was probably just another parent. But the instincts she had built over 27 years of having no one to fall back on were screaming that something was terribly wrong. That evening, Dolly knocked on her apartment door. The warm smile Lena was used to seeing on her 68-year-old neighbor's face was gone, replaced by a look of concern. "Someone was asking questions today," Dolly said in a low voice. "While you were at work. A man in a suit, with his hair all slicked back. He was very polite, but the phony, kind of polite. He asked where the little girl goes to school, what time you get her, and if anyone else ever picks her up." The color drained from Lena's face. "What did you say to him?" "I told him I had no idea," Dolly answered, her eyes sharp. "I have been around long enough to know you do not give information to strangers." Lena shut the door and locked it twice. She peeked into the bedroom where Phoebe was sleeping with Biscuit. Then she took out her phone and called Jude. He was there in less than 15 minutes. But the man who walked into her Dorchester apartment that night was not the daddy Jude who would sit on the floor and drink imaginary tea from a tiny pink cup. This man was someone else entirely. His face was a cold mask, his jaw set, and his gray-blue eyes looked like hardened steel. This was Jude Kensington, the head of the family. This was the man the entire East Coast knew better than to challenge. He listened without a word as Lena explained every single detail: the sport utility vehicle, the man asking Dolly questions. Then, he made one phone call to his associate, Brennan. "I need you to run something. A black sport utility vehicle with tinted windows has been seen near Pano Solis Preschool on Adams Street. I am sending you the license plate number. Find out who is asking questions about my daughter." His voice was not loud, but every word had a weight to it that sent a chill down Lena's spine. It was not a fear of him, but a fear of the world he was a part of, a world that was now reaching its grimy hands toward her daughter. The information arrived just before midnight. Brennan called back, his voice tight with tension. The men belonged to Vincent Corsetti, a rival from New York who was trying to gain an advantage over Jude in a territory dispute. They had found out that Jude had a daughter and a past love. They saw a weakness, a point of leverage. A 4-year-old girl and an orphan from Dorchester with no family to protect her were the perfect targets to use against him. Lena overheard Jude on the phone with Brennan, talking about things she could not quite follow. But she understood enough to know that her little girl had become a pawn in a game between powerful men. A wave of rage, hotter and stronger than any fear she had ever felt, washed over her. "This," Lena said, her voice shaking with fury, not fear, as Jude hung up and faced her. "This is why I am so scared. This is exactly what I tried to tell you at the lake. Your world is a dangerous place, and you have dragged us right into the middle of it." "Lena, Phoebe is 4 years old," she whispered, the words sharp as glass, trying not to wake her sleeping daughter in the next room. 4 years old, Jude, and now someone is watching her, asking about her, and knows exactly where she goes to school and when I pick her up. All because of you. Because of the Kensington name. Because of the empire you have built." She took a step back from him, and that single step created a gulf between them wider than any physical space. "My daughter is not a pawn in your war, Jude Kensington. I have spent my entire life on my own, and I can do it again. If I have to, I will take Phoebe and leave Boston. I have been running my whole life, so I know how to disappear." Jude did not say, "I will take care of it," or "trust me," or any of the other hollow promises Lena had heard from too many people. Instead, he just looked at her, his gray-blue eyes as cold and hard as steel. He gave a single nod, then turned and walked out of the apartment. After the door clicked shut, Lena was left standing in the living room, with her hand over her heart. She listened as his footsteps faded down the old staircase, having no idea that in the next 12 hours, Jude Kensington would tear down the empire he had spent 15 years building. The very first call he made was the moment he sat down in his car. He did not call Brennan, he called Vincent Corsetti directly. Brennan, who was driving, stared at Jude as if he had gone completely mad. He listened as Jude spoke into the phone with a voice so calm it sent a chill down his spine. "Vincent, this is Jude Kensington. That South Boston territory deal you wanted? I am giving it to you, all of it. I have only one condition. My family is off limits. From this point forward, if any of your men so much as look at my daughter or her mother again, this will no longer be a negotiation. It will be a war, and you know I am not a man who bluffs." Corsetti accepted the deal. Of course he did. The South Boston territory was worth tens of millions of dollars, and he had just won it without a single shot being fired. But Jude was not finished. His second call was to Daniel Whitfield, a corporate lawyer. He was not a mob attorney who knew how to hide crimes in legal jargon. He was the type who wore crisp white shirts and worked in glass offices downtown, handling legitimate business transfers. "Daniel, I need to see you right now, tonight. I want to draw up the paperwork to transfer all unofficial operations of Kensington Holdings to the Executive Council. Every last bit of it. I am walking away completely." The silence on the other end of the line was long enough for Jude to know Daniel was struggling to understand what he had just heard. Then the lawyer asked, "Are you certain?" "We are talking about the entire network, all of it." Brennan drove him to the law firm. He did not say a word the entire way. But as Jude opened the car door to get out, Brennan finally spoke up. "Boss, that is 15 years of your life. It is the empire you built with your own 2 hands, all while living under the immense pressure of your father's legacy." Jude paused with one foot on the pavement and looked back over his shoulder. "Everything I built," he said, his voice quiet, but every word filled with absolute conviction, "is currently sleeping in an apartment in Dorchester, holding a stuffed bear named Biscuit." Brennan stared at him for a long moment, then just nodded. He said nothing else. 3 hours later, Jude had signed away everything. Every document, every transfer, every single agreement. When he walked out of that law office at 2 in the morning, he was no longer the most powerful mob boss on the East Coast. He was just Jude Kensington, a 36-year-old man who owned a legal real estate and casino corporation, and the father to a 4-year-old girl whose first 4 years he had missed. But he did not go straight to Lena's apartment. He went back to his mansion and into his private study. He opened a desk drawer and pulled out a rolled-up tube he had kept hidden there for weeks, since before the picnic, since before he even let himself hope. They were architectural drawings, the very first project he had designed himself since giving up his dream of becoming an architect 15 years ago. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Jude was standing outside apartment 312 in the Maple Building in Dorchester. He had dark circles under his eyes. His suit was wrinkled, and his tie was loose. His hair was a mess from running his hands through it all night. He held a stack of transfer documents in one hand. In the other, he held the roll of blueprints. He knocked gently. Lena opened the door. Her eyes were shadowed from a lack of sleep, and she was still in her clothes from the day before. It was obvious she had been waiting up, trying to figure out where she could run. She stared at him, and he stared back at her. Then, Jude placed the stack of papers on her kitchen table. "These are the transfer papers," he said. "I signed them. All the underground operations have been handed over to the council. I am completely out. Kensington Holdings is a legitimate business now. Real estate, casinos, investments. It is all clean." Lena looked down at the papers, but did not reach for them. She looked back at him, her expression still guarded. But underneath that guarded look, something else was fighting to get out. It looked a lot like hope. Jude unrolled the blueprints, spreading the large sheet across her small kitchen table. He had to use a coffee mug and a salt shaker to hold down the corners because the table was too small. The design came to life under the flickering fluorescent light. The lines were clean, precise, and beautiful. They showed the skill of professional training, but they were drawn with passion. It was a 2-story brownstone in Brookline with a red brick exterior. On the first floor, there was a studio with huge north-facing windows, the kind of light every graphic designer dreams of. The second floor had an art room for a child, with white walls perfect for hanging up drawings, and a small easel set up by the window. In the backyard, there was a young oak tree with a swing set. "This was my first project," Jude said, his voice softer than it had been all night. "I wanted to be an architect before my father made me into something different. This is the dream I had to bury. Now I am digging it back up." He pointed to each part of the house. "A studio for you. It gets northern light, which is exactly what you need for your design work. An art room for Phoebe. The walls are white so she can fill them with her art. And a backyard with a swing, because last week she asked me why our house did not have one. Jude, I am not for sale. You cannot buy my love with a house." He spoke quickly, as if he was afraid she would get the wrong idea. "This is not a house. This is a promise. It is a promise that I am ready to rebuild everything from scratch. Cleanly, with no shadows, no criminal underworld. Just me, you, and Phoebe." Lena looked at the drawing. Her fingers traced the lines of the studio, where he had even sketched in a desk and a wide window. Then her hand moved to the small art room, where he had drawn Phoebe's easel in the exact spot where the light would be the best. Her hand was shaking. "Do you know what my biggest fear is?" she whispered. "It is not being poor. I was poor my whole life, and I made it through. It is not being alone. I have been alone forever, and I am still here." She looked up at him, her eyes glistening, but not shedding tears. "The thing I am most afraid of is not having a place to belong. My whole life, I went from one foster home to the next, from one rented room to another. I have never had a place that felt like home. No one has ever looked at me and said, 'You belong here,' and actually meant it." Jude took a slow, gentle step closer, the same way he had approached Phoebe when they first met, giving her space to move away if she wanted to. She did not move. "You belong here," he said, his voice deep and steady, but with a slight tremor. "Both of you belong here." Lena looked at him, at his gray-blue eyes that were tired from a sleepless night. She saw the wrinkled suit from the long hours spent in a law office signing away his empire. She looked at the blueprint of a house, a design born from a dream he had given up 15 years ago. Then she stepped forward and put her hand on his chest, right over the inner pocket where he had kept the coaster with her name on it for 5 years. She could feel his heart pounding under her palm. The mob boss, the architect, the father of her child, the man who had just burned down his entire empire for a 4-year-old girl and the woman he never stopped loving. The first kiss in 5 years was so light, it was barely there. It was just breath against breath, lips brushing against lips, hesitant and shaky. It was as if they were testing to see if something so broken could ever be fixed. Then the kiss grew deeper, steadier, and stronger. 5 years of loneliness, 5 years of anger, and 5 years of a love buried under layers of self-protection, all melted away in that tiny kitchen. It happened under the flickering fluorescent light, between the stack of legal papers and the blueprint for a dream house. When they finally pulled apart, both of their eyes were wet. "So, this is a yes, is it not?" Jude whispered. Lena smiled, and it was the first time he had seen her smile without any walls up. It was not a shield or a defense, it was just Lena. "This is a let us build it together," she said. The brownstone in Brookline was finished on a crisp autumn morning, just as the last leaves on the maple trees were changing from a brilliant red to a deep copper. The red brick of the house glowed warmly in the pale sunlight. The large windows reflected a perfectly clear blue sky. In the backyard, the young oak tree was still holding onto its last few yellow leaves, as if it wanted to welcome the new family with its most beautiful colors before winter set in. Phoebe was the first one to walk through the front door. She stood in the entryway, holding Biscuit tightly under her arm. Her eyes, which were a perfect copy of his, grew so wide they seemed to take up her whole face. And then she let out a scream, a sound of pure, unfiltered joy that only a child can make. "My room! Mama, Daddy, where is my room?" Jude led her up the stairs. When he opened the door to the art room, Phoebe stopped in her tracks. The walls were white. A small easel was placed by the window to catch the morning sun. A brand new box of crayons and a set of watercolors were neatly arranged on a shelf. And in the corner, there was a small wooden bed that Jude had built himself. It was the perfect size for a stuffed bear. Phoebe looked at the little bed, then at Biscuit, and then at her daddy, with eyes that shone with happiness. She carefully placed Biscuit on his new bed and pulled the tiny blanket up to his neck. Then she turned to Jude and announced with the most serious expression a 4-year-old could possibly make, "Biscuit has his own room now." Jude knelt down and wrapped her in a hug. Lena stood in the doorway watching them. She had to grip the doorframe to keep her balance, not from sadness, but because for the first time in 27 years, her heart felt fuller than it had ever been built to hold. "Afternoon!" The doorbell chimed. Catherine Kensington was standing on the doorstep, dressed in a tasteful light gray suit, her platinum hair styled perfectly, as usual. But she was holding something that Lena never would have anticipated. It was an antique silver picture frame, heavy and covered in detailed carvings. It was clearly a family heirloom, not something recently purchased. Inside the frame was the photograph Catherine had insisted on taking the week before at the mansion. It showed Phoebe sitting in a large green velvet armchair in the main living room, holding Biscuit on her lap, a wide smile revealing her dimple. It was the first official portrait of a Kensington granddaughter. Catherine presented the frame to Lena. Then she rested a hand on Lena's shoulder. She said nothing because she did not have to. The gentle pressure, just firm enough to be comforting, but light enough to respect the delicate boundaries they had been building for weeks, said more than any formal declaration of acceptance ever could. Catherine came inside and spent an hour with Phoebe in the art room. She showed her how to mix blue and white paint to create the color of clouds, and told her that Jude had loved painting clouds when he was a little boy, because he always said they were the only things in the world that no one could ever own. When it was time for Catherine to leave, she did not use the front door. She went out back and walked through the yard, stopping for a moment under a young oak tree to look back at the house. The light was on in a window on the second floor. Phoebe's playful shadow danced on the curtain, and the sound of her laughter drifted out into the crisp autumn air. Catherine just stood there for a while, all by herself, the warm glow from the window lighting up the face of the family's strong matriarch. For the first time in a very long time, she smiled. It was a private smile, not meant for anyone else to see. The kind of smile that comes from knowing you have finally done the right thing after years of watching things go wrong. Then she turned and walked away, her footsteps barely making a sound on the slate path leading to the back gate, removing herself from a picture she understood was now complete without her. That night, after Phoebe had her bath and changed into the star-covered pajamas that Catherine had bought for her, Jude tucked her into bed. Phoebe snuggled down under the covers on her new mattress, grabbed Biscuit from the nightstand to sleep with him, and gazed up at her father. "Daddy, this is our house now, right?" "Yes, Princess. This is our house forever." "Forever," she repeated with a smile, her dimple making an appearance. Her heavy, silver-blue eyelids slowly drifted shut, and within a few minutes, her breathing settled into the soft, even rhythm of a child who was finally, she had her very own room, a father, a mother, a real home. Jude just watched her for a long moment before he headed downstairs. He carefully unrolled the painting Phoebe had created at Walden Pond. It showed 3 figures holding hands beside a lake, with the word family written above them. He hung it on the living room wall, right in the spot where it would be the first thing anyone saw when they walked in. Next to the drawing, he placed a small glass frame. Inside was an old coaster from Rosie's Cafe. Its edges were worn, the Rose logo had faded, and on the back, written in slanted blue ink and now blurred by time, was the name Lena. The coaster was finally safe behind glass. After 5 years in his suit pocket, after thousands of nights on a bedside table in London, after his thumb had traced the letters in the dark tens of thousands of times, it had found its final resting place. It was no longer an object of pain, no longer proof of loss, but the very first page of a new story. Lena stood by the window in her first-floor studio, a room Jude had designed just for her. The large, north-facing window allowed moonlight to pour across the new wooden floor in a silver path. She stood there with her hand on the cool glass, looking out into the backyard where the swing moved softly in the evening breeze. Jude came up, quietly behind her, and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on the top of her head. They stood together in the moonlight, listening to the wind. They heard the soft creaks of the new house settling, as if it were breathing. Through the baby monitor Jude had installed on their first day, they could hear the steady rhythm of Phoebe's sleep drifting down from upstairs. "We lost 5 years," Lena whispered. Jude held her a little tighter. "We have a lifetime ahead of us," he answered. And so the story ends here, in a brownstone in Brooklyn, where the coaster with Lena's name is protected by glass beside a child's drawing labeled family. where the stuffed bear named Biscuit has his own bed, and where a former mob boss burned down an entire empire to build a house with a swing for his daughter, and where a 27-year-old orphan has finally found a place where she belongs. Sometimes life takes a great deal from us. It takes time, it takes opportunities. It takes the people we love. But sometimes, if we are courageous enough to open our hearts again, strong enough to forgive, and patient enough to trust in actions over words, miracles can happen. They might arrive late, but they are never too late. If this story has touched your heart, please press the like button to support our channel in telling more stories like this one. Share the video with the people you love, or with anyone who needs to be reminded that no matter how hard life gets, love and truth always find their way home. And please do not forget to subscribe so you will not miss the moving new stories we post every day. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever lost someone and then found them again? Or are you, like Lena, still on a journey to find the place where you belong? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single line and want to hear what is deep in your hearts. We wish all of you watching this video good health, happy lives, and peace every single day. Goodbye, and we will see you in the next video. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.